Welcome explorers today. Dive into the final part of this thrilling TTP narration of Hunting with Predators by Banancake, a 25-part fan-made saga from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on our /HFY. But do not fret, for there is a second book that I am starting on effective immediately.
Memory transcription subject, Vickery, the honey badger. Date, standardized human time, October 31, 2136, 14 days after the Battle of Earth. I spent hours in that barn. Time started to become insignificant. Slowly, piece by piece, I told Hugh everything that had happened from the start. I explained how we took control of the destroyer and how I'd killed someone in the process. I told him about our desperate attempt to save Tenga and how miserably it failed. At some point, the commotion outside went silent, and light stopped seeping between the planks of the barn. Hugh brought out an old rocking chair for me to sit on near the fire, as well as a quilted blanket. He brought me a drink called tea, which he assured me was little more than chamomile and mint leaves boiled in water. The hot liquid soothed my aching throat and warmed me up even more. Lucky sat by my side as I slowly rocked back and forth in the chair, almost subconsciously. It was the safest I'd felt in weeks. There was some relief in knowing that it was over, but regret in knowing that I couldn't change anything that had happened. He was delirious, I whispered. Hugh sat across from me on a stool, leaning towards me with his eyes narrowed as he listened. I think he started hallucinating. He looked right past me. I think he saw an old friend of his just before. One he called his brother. I took in a long, shaky breath. He had the same name everyone calls me. Hugh nodded slowly. Well, it sounds to me like they're together now. I rocked gently and clutched the cup tighter to my chest. Lucky repositioned herself next to me and lied back down. I hope so, I choked. But I couldn't accept it. He went so peacefully, but I was furious. I didn't want to let him go. I looked over at the fire dancing about within the black iron of the stove. Selfish. Nobody wants to see a friend go. Nothing selfish about that. I looked down at the floor. I just don't know what I'm going to do without him. He understood what I'm going through better than anyone. And I can't just go home and pretend none of this happened. No, Venlil would understand. They'd probably just throw me in an institution somewhere, and I swallowed a breath and tapped my paws on the side of the cup. I don't know what to do, I strained. Hugh nodded and seemed to think for a moment. Well, if he understood you that well, surely you learned something from him. Something about yourself. He seems to me like the mentoring type, though I can't know for sure. I chuckled slightly. Yeah, he was. I thought for a moment. He told me that I was a fighter, not a predator. And he said that a good fighter needs something to fight for. Hugh pursed his lips and nodded. And what do you want to fight for? I stopped rocking and thought for a moment. I'm not sure. I want to help humanity, but Tenga asked me to leave this war so I wouldn't end up like him when he was younger. He said I could do a lot of good for them without ever being on the front lines. I looked down at Lucky, who returned my gaze with her sharp, golden eyes. Remember when I asked you to teach me how to care for Lucky before I left? Hugh nodded. I think I'd like to start there. But I guess you're leaving, aren't you? Hugh smiled. No, I'm staying here. I've got all the food and firewood I need and then some up at the house. Lots of plant-based stuff from the gardens. Plenty to hunt around these parts too. You're welcome to stay, I wouldn't mind the company. Have you been alone all this time? Hugh looked down and nodded. Yeah. Wife died some time ago. Kids left home, and, well, now that we can communicate with the outside, maybe I can contact them. I pray every day that they're alive. I wrapped the blanket around me tighter. I hope you find them. Hugh nodded and stood up. All right then. If that'll help you find your course, then I'll help you train this little troublemaker. He bent down and rubbed Lucky's head. He smiled. Just like the good old days. Date, Standardized Human Time January 11, 2137, 86 days after the Battle of Earth. I set my eyes dead ahead as I walked down the corridor of the Space Center, trying to ignore the looks from the people crowding the area. There were mixed reactions. Most humans pulled out their phones and started recording, lining the hall with harsh, white lights from their cameras. The Venlil, on the other hand, were hiding behind the humans for the most part. Several of them simply hurried away as I approached. The sea of people continued parting in front of me as camera flashes blinded me from every angle. I noticed some yodel and other various species mixed in with them. Reese was exactly right. The galaxy we came back to was nothing like the one we left. I didn't believe the Federation was modifying races to be herbivores until I saw the video myself. Their deception had brought humanity a whole host of new allies, and for good cause. Molding and shaping entire species to their liking without their knowledge was sadistic, to put it lightly. I wondered what they might have done to the Venlil. I arrived at the end of the corridor and entered a massive hangar, where a crowd of media and military personnel had gathered behind a set of small barriers. Soldiers and a few policemen guarded the entrance to the rest of the hangar. The crowd, again, parted in front of me as I moved through. I arrived at the barriers, where two guards looked down at me and then just behind me as they moved the gates and allowed me inside. I nodded and walked through onto the open concrete floor. On the other side, the hangar doors had been opened, allowing the evening sun to illuminate the dark interior of the empty structure. In the middle of the floor, a smaller crowd had gathered around a large steel pillar. It had a diameter and height similar to an oak tree. Flowers, photographs, and other trinkets were placed around the pillar's base beneath a plaque embedded into the steel. Dozens of soldiers in formal military garb gathered around with their families. They stood aside as I slowly walked up behind them to allow me to see. I took a closer look at the pictures around the pillar's base and recognized a few faces. These were all crew members aboard UNS Cardinal. I stepped closer still and saw hundreds of names engraved into the metal around the cylinder's circumference. I took a deep breath and straightened slightly as I craned my neck at the giant mast. "Sit." Nudging into me slightly, Lucky sat down next to me, panting as her tongue hung from her mouth. She'd grown very quickly over the past couple of months. She was fast approaching my height, and even sitting down, she was just a few inches under eye level with me. Her fur was thicker, growing longer and longer as winter went on. She gazed up at the pillar along with me, the dark fur around her eyes accentuating their amber glow. Plenty of experienced handlers reached out to Hugh and me in the weeks after the evacuation, offering to help train her. They taught me everything they could in the time they had. Lucky had been training for search and rescue, and she'd gotten her own custom harness as a result. Her name was stitched over the side of the tan fabric in black with a green four-leaf clover beneath it. A universal human symbol for good luck. Training a dog that was half wild had its own unique set of challenges compared to more domesticated dogs, but Lucky was proving to be a quick learner. I worked with her every day in the fields outside Hamilton, and our bond and trust for each other was becoming stronger than I ever thought possible when we first met. My fear of her had evaporated, just like with the humans. However, as she'd gotten bigger, I'd become more wary. She didn't quite know her own strength, and it's pretty scary when a creature as tall as you on 4 legs and 3 times your strength gets in a playful mood. As I stood there, I felt a rather rough nudge on the shoulder from behind. Lucky whipped around in a blur and barked, causing the whole assembly to go quiet for a few seconds. Her face was terrifying. She bared her sharp teeth as her eyes squinted. I turned to see Grant recoiling away from Lucky, his hand drawn close to his chest for fear of losing it. He smiled nervously. "Hey, Vic, Lucky." Lucky growled for a moment before she seemed to recognize him. She perked up immediately, a complete 180 from her previous expression, and sat down in front of the human. Her tongue hung out as she shuffled excitedly. Grant scratched her head. "Hey girl, sorry." He looked up at me. "Protective, isn't she?" I laughed. "Yeah. Just be glad she recognized you." Reese and Querek pushed through the crowd. Reese approached cautiously. Well, that sure as hell made it easy to find you. He looked lucky over. Damn, she got big. He knelt down and stroked the side of her neck. And a lot less timid. She's been around a lot of people since you guys left. I stood next to the wolf, and she circled around me before sitting behind me. It's been a while. Grant crossed his arms. It has. You been doing okay? I shifted somewhat anxiously. Yeah. Yeah, I've learned a lot since you guys left. Met some great people. Have you visited home yet? Reese asked. I scratched the fur around my neck. Sensing my uneasiness, Lucky stood up and wrapped her body around behind me. I leaned back against her, enveloped in her warm, fuzzy fur. No. I don't think I'm ready for that yet. I understand, Reese assured me. But your family knows you're alive, right? Yeah. I told them where I was, they just don't understand why I won't come home. I don't think I could explain it if I tried. Grant nodded. Well, you know how to reach us. If you need anything, you just ask, and we'll get it done. I flicked my ears. I know. Thank you. I looked over at Querek, who was halfway hiding behind Reese. It seemed he hadn't quite overcome his fear of dogs after encountering the wolves. I guess I couldn't really blame him, but it hurt to see him like that. I swished my tail at him. How's your arm? Well, he stepped out from behind Reese and held up his paw. He had a sort of glove over it with thin, metal rods running along the outside, leading over the top of each digit. He moved his paw around as though it had never been injured. I'm still getting used to it, but I should be able to fly again eventually. I stepped closer, studying the device more closely as my ears perked up. This is incredible. I laughed. I turned his paw in mine as I looked it over. Querek nodded. Yeah, human and Venlil engineers designed it. Works pretty well, but they're still working out the kinks. Oh. Also. I have something for you. He turned around and picked up a small box he'd set on the ground earlier. The carvers gave this to me and asked me to give it to you next time I saw you. They said they couldn't figure out how to get a hold of you. My eyes went wide. I met the carvers at Tenga's funeral. They were Vic's family, and Tenga's by extent. What is it? I asked, taking the box from his arms. I don't know, but they said it was important. I removed the lid, and inside, I saw a familiar diamond pattern woven into tan fabric. The red silhouettes of earth fauna decorated the edges. My eyes started watering. I couldn't really find any of Tenga's surviving family. Most of the people I did find were either long dead or still missing, so I gave Tenga's blanket to the carvers at the funeral as something to remember him by. I spoke to them for a while, told them I was sorry I couldn't save him, and never spoke to them again. It turned out I was right, it was handmade. They said Tenga took it with him on deployments as a reminder of home. It had apparently been woven by his grandmother when he was young. Tenga's family had a lot of Native American heritage, and they were proud of it, hence the patterns on the back of the blanket. I carefully took it out of the box and placed the cardboard on the floor. I held the blanket in both paws and let it hang down. It clearly wasn't a blanket anymore. It appeared to have been stitched into some kind of clothing. As I studied it, a note fell onto the concrete, and I knelt down and picked it up, placing the blanket over my arm. I shakily unfolded the letter. Vickery. We hope this letter finds you, wherever you may be. There are a few things you should know. When Tenga came to us after losing Vic, he was in pieces. He blamed it all on himself, and he couldn't allow himself to be happy carrying around all that guilt. But we never saw it that way. In our eyes, he was Vic's best friend. His brother. And that made him our son, just as Vic was, and we loved him as such when he couldn't love himself. It took Tenga a long time to see things the way we did. To see that he was not responsible for Vic's death, but rather an abundance of his life. When we heard what happened in Montana, it only proved what we'd always known: Tenga had changed for the better. He valued peace and understanding over all else. He was a cold, hardened soldier that wouldn't bat an eye at death for a long time. Cold-heartedness made him a good soldier, but love made him a fighter. We want you to know that you need no forgiveness from us, but rather our gratitude. Your bravery put a smile on Tenga's face at the very end, and there are few greater gifts a mortal man can ask for. But though you may not need it, you have it. Always. We decided to come together and make something for you. We all agreed that Tenga would want you to have his blanket, so we turned it into a poncho for you. We had a lot of laughs trying to figure out how to make a poncho for a Venlil. If it doesn't fit, send it back, and we'll get it right eventually. Wear it as a reminder of Tenga. As a reminder that death is powerless to take away the love and warmth of a dear friend. As a reminder that, though you may be angry with yourself, you are everything Tenga ever hoped to achieve. With love. The Carvers. I only just managed to read the last line before it became impossible to see. Tears streamed down my face as I folded the letter. It felt like the crushing weight of the whole universe was lifted from my shoulders. I gripped the letter tight as beads of salty tears dotted the paper. I looked up to see Grant, Reese, and Querek standing around me. Reese smiled, his eyes were glassy. Well. Try it on. I looked down at the poncho hanging over my arm before lifting it up and slipping my head inside. It draped around my shoulders, hanging down to my waist. I stuck my arms out of either side and looked down. It's perfect. Grant nodded. It suits you. I clutched the fabric around my neck. The material was soft and warm. It was cleaner than I'd ever seen it. I remembered waking up in Tenga's arms, wrapped in it. I remembered being huddled under it with Querek while we followed Tenga over the ridges and plains. I remembered the dread that we might not make it, that Earth might be done for. But shining through it all, I remembered Tenga leading the way, never stopping, never quitting. I remembered feeling doomed, only for him to pick me up and carry me on. I remembered Tenga. I laughed as I clutched the blanket tighter and buried my face in it before completely breaking down into a sobbing mess. As I closed my eyes, I was assaulted by hugs from all sides. Even Querek was in there, just across from Lucky. I heard the people surrounding us start going quiet, but I didn't care. I held them tight for a long while. Somehow, that simple letter managed to find a way through the shadows in my heart. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I would actually be okay. When the embrace ended, Grant rubbed the top of my head. We've missed you, buddy. I wiped my eyes. I've missed you guys too. Grant looked around. We'll stay with you as long as you need. Around an hour passed, and the sun started to set out over the airfield. I'd spent that time reading over every name I came across on the pillar. Most of the crowd was long gone, moving outside to wait for the main event. A pair of large trucks pulled up to the hangar entrance and parked. The drivers waited patiently on the tarmac. There was no hurry. I noticed quite a few groups of humans still gathered in front of pictures near the base of the pillar, their faces still wet with tears. It was sad, but seeing so many families together was comforting. The humans were slowly healing from an incomprehensible loss of life. Before I got around the whole pillar, I found Azek's name not far from the plaque. I hadn't known him long, but he was further proof to me that the Venlil had fight in them, somewhere deep down. I stood in front of the plaque and read it before the others grouped around me as I looked up at the pillar one last time. Reese put his arm around me. Come on. I know a good place we can go to watch. Reese brought us to the roof of a nearby rocket assembly building while the pillar was carried down to the launch pad and lifted by a giant crane. Reese apparently knew a few of the staff, and they allowed us in and onto the roof. Reese assured me this wasn't the first time he'd done this. A couple more hours passed as we watched the pillar get lifted up to the fairings, and the sun went down, revealing the starry sky above. The air grew still and cold. I pulled the poncho tighter around me as Lucky sat next to me, curiously looking over the landscape. Reese took a small radio from his coat and placed it on the railing as we leaned over it. As he tuned it in, I looked over. You know all of this is streaming online, right? Reese smiled. This will always be the best way to experience it. He turned a dial, and a voice came over the tiny speaker. Here at Kennedy Space Center. It's a clear and beautiful night and a very rare launch. 3 combined Vega heavy lift boosters are on the pad, and the fairings are closed and ready for launch. The payload today is very special. The center mast for UNS Montana is scheduled to launch into lunar orbit, where it will link up with the lunar shipyard, and construction of the heavy cruiser will begin. Several minutes passed as the broadcast continued. I looked over at everyone leaning over the railing. So where are you all headed after this? Grant looked over. Wherever the war takes me, I suppose. There's a lot of work to do still. I requested that they let me serve on Montana when she's finished, but I suppose time will tell. I nodded as my ears pinned back. You better take care of yourself. Grant snickered and looked over at me. You know how paranoid I get. I'll be back before you know it. I looked past him at Querek. What about you? How's Tommy? Querek swished his tail. He's doing a lot better. He took his first steps the other day. Once they clear me to fly again, the UN wants me to help train new Venlil pilots. I'm excited. Reese put his back to the railing. The war's over for me. My family is gonna need me home for a while. We're playing it safe and staying at my dad's old farm. Living off the land. Things are still a little wild in the cities. He looked over at me. What about you? You figure out what you want to do. I looked down at the ground far below me, illuminated by the bright lights lining the side of the building. A cold breeze ruffled the fur on my face. I guess I'm going to just continue the long journey home. Find a new place to stay for a while. I don't like all this attention. I rubbed Lucky's head. I've got a few plans. I think I know where my fight is. And there's our confirmation. We are go for launch. A smile crawled over Reese's face as he picked up the radio. Here we go. Reactors primed. Engines are starting. Lift off in T-10. Grant and Reese started counting down along with the announcer, which caught Querek and me slightly off guard. After seeing the excitement on their faces, we both joined in. I watched steam pour over the massive white exterior of the rocket in the distance as countless stars twinkled overhead in the cold winter air. 3, 2, 1. A bright white light from the bottom of the rocket illuminated the entire area, reflecting like the moon in the water surrounding Cape Canaveral. I squinted as dust shot up from the ground around the launch pad. Seconds later, a resounding thud rattled my skull as the tremendous sound of the engine's lighting finally reached us. The roaring rocket ascended into the night sky, leaving behind a long, cyan trail of exhaust as the massive boosters shot out exhaust at incredible rates. I could feel the heat warming my face, cutting right through the frigid air. The rocket soared into the sky, leaving behind a trail of glowing gas, marking its trajectory like a shooting star. Grant and Reese cheered loudly, and Lucky howled right along with them. I laughed as I rubbed her head and craned my neck upward. I was filled with hope. Hope that one day, the words on that plaque will become reality. The rocket faded from view, disappearing into the backdrop of the Milky Way. Written on this center pillar, forged from the debris of UNS Cardinal, are the names of 761 crewmen who lost their lives aboard UNS Cardinal while defending their home from Federation forces. On October 24, 2136, 8 ships in Cardinal's battle group, including Cardinal herself, were declared lost with all hands. On October 31, all 8 of those declarations were revoked. A brave group of 14 crash survivors in the mountains of Montana, human and Venlil alike, assaulted and captured a crashed Federation destroyer. Marine Lieutenant Tenga sacrificed his life to ensure that the encounter ended with minimal casualties. On both sides, over 500 civilians and military personnel, crew members of the aforementioned 8 ships among them, would later be rescued from the nearby town as a result of their actions. The ship that shall be built around this pillar, UNS Montana, is named so in commemoration of these events. It is humanity's hope that this ship and the legacy it carries will serve as a reminder to the entire galaxy. A reminder that we are not animals, we are people. That we are far more than our base instincts. And that every sapient creature in this galaxy deserves the right and opportunity to live a peaceful life, for they are people as well. As a reminder that humanity and her allies will fight tooth and nail until the entire galaxy agrees with this simple belief. There are no predators or prey in this galaxy. Only people. And people ought to love one another.